To be born a wealthy wife in 1889 was to inherit a silk cage. You could wear the diamonds, you could host the ball, but you could not own the money, keep the children, or walk out the door. The law itself had dissolved you into your husband. And in every druggist's shop in America and England, for a single penny, you could buy a tin of arsenical flypaper that would dissolve him right back. This is the story of three wealthy women who stood at that pharmacy counter, counted their coins, and decided that murder was cheaper than marriage. Chapter 1. A penny bought a perfect murder. In the spring of 1889, a Liverpool housewife walked into a chemist's shop and purchased, for the price of a loaf of bread, enough arsenic to kill 20 men. She did not sign a book. She did not give a reason. She slid 2 pennies across the counter, took a flat paper packet of fly papers, and walked out into a city where arsenic was as common as tea. The chemist thought nothing of it. He had sold the same tins to dozens of women that month. By nightfall, the packets would be soaking in bedroom basins all over England, bleeding a clear poison into the water. This was the quiet genius of the Gilded Age pharmacy. Murder was not hidden in a back room. Murder was stocked on the open shelf beside the tooth powder and the hair tonic and the colored soap. Arsenic trioxide had saturated the domestic world. It lived in the green wallpaper of fashionable parlors, a pigment called Scheele's green that flaked off into the nursery air. It lived in the face creams women pressed into their cheeks to achieve a porcelain pallor. It lived in the fly papers sold for 2 pennies a sheet. It lived in patent tonics swallowed daily for fatigue, dyspepsia, and nerves. It lived in the arsenical candles that burned in drawing rooms. It lived in the dyes of children's stockings, in the taxidermy of birds under glass, in the glue of postage stamps. A single ounce of white arsenic trioxide, ordered at a druggist's counter in 1889, cost perhaps 5 or 6 cents. That ounce contained roughly 437 grains. A fatal adult dose sat somewhere between 2 and 3 grains. The arithmetic was merciless. 6 cents, carefully administered, was enough to bury an entire household. A tin of flypaper, soaked overnight, yielded enough soluble arsenic to kill a grown man twice. And this was the paradox that made the Gilded Age such fertile ground for domestic poisoning. The ubiquity of the drug was its own disguise. When a husband died vomiting, clutching his stomach, burning with thirst, a physician had no reliable way to distinguish the work of a wife from the work of the wallpaper. Gastric fever, English cholera, bilious attack. The death certificate could read a dozen innocent things. Arsenic produced the same symptoms as a bad oyster, a summer flu, a failing heart. The Marsh test had existed since 1840. A chemist named James Marsh had proven at the French trial of Marie Lafarge that arsenic could be chased into a body and found there years after burial. But the test required an autopsy, a suspicious doctor, and a family willing to court scandal. Most families were not willing. The respectable household did not exhume its dead. The British Arsenic Act of 1851 had tried to close the door. It required druggists to keep a register, to color their arsenic with soot or indigo, so it could not be mistaken for sugar, to sell only to persons they knew. In practice, the law was a paper fence. Fly papers were exempt. Cosmetic preparations were exempt. Patent tonics were exempt. A woman who wanted arsenic did not need to sign for it. She needed only to walk to a different shop. In Massachusetts, a poison law passed in 1887 required signatures for direct arsenic purchases. It, too, leaked through the fly paper loophole. across the Atlantic, the same tins sat on the same shelves, the same pennies bought the same packets, and the same wives carried them home in the same brown paper. Consider the scale of the market. By the 1880s, British chemists were importing arsenical products in quantities measured not in ounces, but in tons. Flypaper manufacturers produced tens of millions of sheets a year. The wallpaper industry papered an empire in green. The cosmetic trade sold complexion wafers by the case. One study of the period estimated that the average middle-class English home contained enough arsenic in its walls and its medicine chest and its kitchen drawer to kill every person who slept beneath its roof. This was the first fact you needed to understand about the world our three women lived in. The weapon was not rare. The weapon was the wallpaper. And when a wife reached that breaking point, when the husband became intolerable, when the door would not open, she did not have to conspire with a hired killer. She did not have to hide a pistol in her skirts. She had only to walk half a block, hand 2 pennies to a man who would forget her face within the hour, and carry home the silent answer to every locked room in her life. But before we can understand why she walked to that counter, we have to understand the cage she was walking out of. And that cage was not built of iron. It was built of law. Chapter 2: The Silk Cage with No Key. A respectable married woman in 1880 had fewer legal rights than the parlor maid who cleaned her drawing room at $12 a month. The maid could quit. She could collect her wages, pack her trunk, walk out the service entrance, and vanish into the city. Her body was her own. Her hours belonged to her when the day ended. If her employer struck her, she could leave. If he cheated her, she could sue. She was poor, she was tired, she was often hungry, but she was, in the cold eye of the law, a person. The mistress of the house was not. Under the English common law doctrine of coverture, inherited almost intact by most American states, a woman on her wedding day underwent a legal event called marital unity. The husband and wife were one person, and that person was the husband. Her separate legal existence was, in the chilling phrase of the great jurist William Blackstone, suspended for the duration of the marriage. She could not sign a contract without her husband's consent. She could not sue or be sued in her own name. She could not make a will disposing of her own property. Any money she earned by her own labor belonged to him. Any property she brought into the marriage, unless protected by a carefully drafted trust, belonged to him. Even her children did not belong to her. In a separation, custody defaulted to the father, even if he was a drunkard, even if he beat her, even if he kept a second family across town and squandered the household income on them. The children were his, the house was his, the carriages were his, and in many practical senses, she was his too. The reform movement had been chipping at this wall since 1839, when Mississippi passed the first of the Married Women's Property Acts, allowing women to hold property in their own names. New York followed in 1848. England passed its own act in 1870 and strengthened it in 1882. But the reforms were patchwork. They varied by state, and they varied by country. They applied to some assets and not others. And critically, they did nothing to loosen the grip of the single most powerful financial instrument, binding Gilded Age marriages, the life interest trust. A life interest trust was the preferred vehicle for moving wealth between generations, without letting any individual woman actually control it. A wealthy father would settle his daughter's inheritance on her, but only as income. She would receive the interest, the dividends, the rents for her lifetime. The principal itself was locked away, managed by male trustees, and upon her death would pass to her children or to a named remainder man. The effect was to create a class of women who appeared to live in spectacular wealth, who wore the diamonds and summered at the spas, but who owned none of it. Their fortune sat perpetually behind another person's heartbeat. A widow's income might flow from the life of her deceased husband's brother. A wife's allowance might flow from the life of her mother. A woman facing an unbearable marriage might find that her freedom depended on the continuation of a life she had no power to end by any legal means, and every incentive to end by illegal ones. Divorce was the other theoretical door. In practice, it was barricaded. In England, before 1923, a husband could divorce his wife for adultery alone. A wife had to prove adultery, plus a second aggravating cause, such as cruelty or desertion. In many American states, the grounds were similarly narrow, and even where divorce was legally possible, the social cost was catastrophic. A divorced woman lost her place, she lost her invitations, and she often lost her children. She lost, in many cases, her allowance. She lost her reputation in a century that measured a woman's entire worth by it. Staying meant endurance. Leaving meant ruin. Now stand at the pharmacy counter with her. She is wearing a dress that cost more than the chemist's monthly rent. Her gloves are French. Her hat is trimmed with ostrich feather from a bird that died in South Africa and was shipped through Liverpool in a wooden crate. She holds 2 pennies in her gloved hand, and she is about to commit the one act for which her entire civilization has, however, inadvertently prepared her. The silk she wore to the shop was the evidence of her captivity. The diamonds on her fingers had been bought with money she did not own from a man she could not leave, who could not be made to die of anything as convenient as his own heart. She had been given every luxury except the 2 things a human being needs to survive a bad marriage. She could not go, and she could not make him go. She could only, for the price of a loaf of bread, buy the tin that would end the argument forever. 3 such women are the subject of everything that follows. The first of them stepped onto a steamship in March of 1880, 17 years old, and met the man who would ruin and be ruined by her. Chapter 3. The shipboard romance that ended in a noose. She was 17, unchaperoned in first class, and by the 6th day at sea, she had agreed to marry a man 24 years her senior. Her name was Florence Elizabeth Chandler. She had been born in 1862 in Mobile, Alabama, and in the 3rd year of the American Civil War, into a family that was already a monument to Southern wealth and Southern confusion. Her father, William Chandler, had been a partner in a mobile banking house. Her mother, Caroline, was the daughter of Darius Blake Holbrook, a land speculator who had tied the family fortunes to a vast and half-imaginary estate in Cairo, Illinois, where the Ohio met the Mississippi. The Chandlers moved in the glittering upper circle of the Gulf Coast. They had slaves. They had ships. They had the peculiar Southern certainty that ended with the war. William Chandler died when Florence was an infant. Her mother, still beautiful, still ambitious, still running from a civilization that had collapsed around her, began what would become a 4-marriage career across 3 continents. By the time Florence was a teenager, her mother had reinvented herself as the Baroness Adolphe von Rox, wife of a cavalry officer in the 8th Prussian Cuirassiers, and the 2 of them crisscrossed the Atlantic in pursuit of the season, the spa, the advantageous introduction. The phantom inheritance followed them. The Holbrook estate in Cairo was said to encompass 2,500,000 acres, a figure repeated in every polite introduction, whispered at every dinner table where an eligible man was present. Whether that acreage ever truly existed, whether the Holbrook title had survived the war and the creditors and the 4 husbands, no one quite knew. It hardly mattered. In the drawing rooms of 1880, the rumor of wealth was itself a form of wealth. In March of that year, the Baroness and her daughter boarded the SS Baltic in New York, bound for Liverpool. First class on the Baltic was its own small society. 8 days of crossing, 5 courses at dinner, brandies and introductions in the smoking room, and the same 30 or 40 passengers pacing the same promenade deck under the same pale Atlantic sky. Romance at sea was not incidental to the voyage. It was the voyage. Seated at the captain's table on the second evening was a Liverpool cotton merchant named James Maybrick. He was 41. He was unmarried. He was tall, impeccably tailored, and carried himself with the weary gravity of a man who had made his fortune in the most volatile commodity in the British Empire. He traded American cotton, shuttling between Liverpool and Norfolk, Virginia, where he kept a house and a set of commercial connections. He was, in the language of the period, a very good match. What the Baroness could not see across the captain's roast beef, and what her daughter could not see across the dance floor, was the man's private architecture. James Maybrick had, for nearly a decade, lived in a common law arrangement with a woman named Sarah Ann Robertson. She considered herself his wife. She used his name. She had, by 1880, already borne him several of the 5 children that relationship would eventually produce. She lived in London. She was not told about the Baltic. She would not be told about Florence. James Maybrick also had a habit. In the years he had spent working the cotton ports of the American South, he had encountered a tonic compounded by a Norfolk druggist named Dr. Hopper. The tonic contained strychnine and arsenic. Maybrick had come to depend on it. By his 40th birthday, he was consuming arsenic daily as a medicine, a stimulant, and, he believed, an aphrodisiac. He carried small vials of it in his waistcoat. Florence knew none of this. She knew only that a grave, prosperous, attentive man had singled her out on the 3rd night at sea, asked her to dance on the 4th, and proposed on the 6th. She was 17. She had spent her entire short life being steered by a mother whose primary navigational tool was the marriage market. She said yes. They were married on the 27th of July, 1881, at St. James's Church in Piccadilly. The bride wore white satin. The groom wore gray. Sarah Ann Robertson, whoever she was not on the guest list. For the first years, the marriage had the shape of ordinary upper-middle-class prosperity. They lived between Norfolk and Liverpool. Florence gave birth to a son, James Chandler Maybrick, whom everyone called Bobo, in March of 1882. A daughter, Gladys Evelyn, followed in July of 1886. The family settled permanently in England. In 1888, James Maybrick leased Battle Crease House, a substantial villa in the Aigburth district of Liverpool. It was the kind of house a cotton man aspired to. 18 rooms, a drawing room in green silk, a dining room paneled in oak, a nursery on the upper floor, 2 carriages in the coach house, a household staff of 5, including the nanny Alice Yap, who would eventually become the instrument of Florence's destruction. Florence, at 26, was mistress of it all. The summer of 1888 was the peak of her life. She hosted dinners. She attended the Grand National at Aintree, where James held a racing box. She wore pearls to the opera. She was photographed in a silk evening dress with a sash of watered rose. From the outside, the Maybricks of Battle Crease were a success of the Gilded Age. Cotton money turned into a country house and a match set of beautiful children. But the private reality was already spoiling. James Maybrick's arsenic intake was climbing. His temper was shortening. His business was wobbling under the collapse of Southern cotton prices. And in the spring of the following year, everything Florence had traded her name and her ocean crossing for would begin to come apart in a bedroom at the top of the stairs. She did not yet know what her husband ate for breakfast. Chapter 4. The Husband Who Ate Poison for Breakfast. Every morning at Battle Crease House, James Maybrick sat down to a private ritual that would have killed any other man in Liverpool. Before his coffee, before his toast, before the newspapers were brought in and the children were brought down, James Maybrick took his medicine. He measured a dose of arsenic solution into a glass. He sometimes added strychnine. He occasionally added morphine. He had been known to dose himself with henbane, with prussic acid, with a compound called Fowler's solution that British doctors had been prescribing for half a century. He had developed, by the late 1880s, a tolerance that astonished the pharmacists who sold to him. The Liverpool chemist Edwin Heaton would testify at Florence's trial in the summer of 1889 that James Maybrick had visited his shop up to 5 times a day. He bought a liquid preparation that Heaton had mixed to his specifications, containing a measurable quantity of arsenic. Heaton calculated, based on his records of those daily purchases, that Maybrick was ingesting approximately 1/3 of a grain of arsenic at every sitting, multiple times a day. 1/3 of a grain does not sound like much. Write it out, and it is 21 milligrams. Consider then that a fatal dose for an adult male is between 130 milligrams and 200 milligrams, depending on tolerance. James Maybrick was taking roughly 1/10 of a lethal amount at breakfast alone, and then repeating the dose at lunch, in the afternoon, and sometimes at night. In a single day, he was consuming enough arsenic to kill a stranger twice over. He consumed it over the years in amounts that, should by any pharmacological logic, have already buried him. The medical name for what James Maybrick was doing is arsenic eating. It was a documented phenomenon of the 19th century, most famously practiced by peasants in the Styrian Alps of Austria, who built up their tolerance in tiny increments, believing the poison gave them stamina for mountain work, gloss for their skin, vigor for their marriages. James Maybrick was a Liverpool cotton merchant, not a Styrian shepherd, but he believed the same things. The arsenic, he thought, kept him strong, kept him virile, kept him working the long hours the cotton trade demanded. It also kept him unwell. His hair was thinning in patches. His hands trembled in the mornings. His skin had a yellow cast. His temper, always sharp, he was now volcanic. The household staff noted the pattern. He would rage for no reason. He would weep at the dinner table. He would lock himself in his room for entire afternoons. The arsenic, far from preserving him, was eating him alive at his own instruction. Florence had learned, piece by piece, what kind of man she had actually married. She had learned first about Sarah Ann Robertson. She had learned that her husband had, for a decade before their wedding, lived openly with another woman. She had learned that Sarah had borne 5 children to James, that she still used his name, that he still visited her in London under the pretext of business. She had learned all of this in drips, from overheard servants, from a careless letter, from the private humiliation of a wife who discovers that her marriage was already a second marriage before it began. She had also learned about her husband's temper at close range. On the 29th of March, 1889, after a domestic argument, the subject of which was never fully reconstructed, James Maybrick struck his wife. He gave her a black eye. The evidence would later be presented in court. A servant saw the injury. So did Florence's friends. That assault, on the 29th of March, was the event that seems to have broken whatever remained of her marital patience. The following day, she told a confidant that she loathed her husband. 4 weeks earlier, in London, Florence had begun a quiet adultery of her own. His name was Alfred Brierly. He was a younger Liverpool cotton trader, a business associate of James's, tall, blonde, unmarried. Florence met him at Flatman's Hotel in Holborn on the 21st of March, 1889. They spent 3 days together. She had traveled to London under the thin cover of visiting a sick aunt. Brierly would later insist the affair meant nothing. Florence wrote to him, after it ended, with the wounded ardor of a woman whose first real passion was being discarded. James was running a second household in London. Florence had spent 3 days in a Holborn hotel. The accounts, by the spring of 1889, were almost balanced, except for one asymmetry. James Maybrick's arsenic addiction had made him ill, and a wife was expected to nurse an ill husband. The illness would place the entire apparatus of suspicion into her lap. There was also a financial engine cranking quietly under the floorboards. James had drafted a will in 1889 that left the bulk of his estate, valued at roughly £5,000, in trust for his children, with Florence receiving only a life interest in the household effects and the furniture. The cotton trade was collapsing. The prices of American cotton had fallen through the decade. James's annual income had been shrinking. His debts were mounting. The Maybrick household was running at a burn rate of roughly £3,000 a year, which was 15,000 American dollars at the time, the wages of perhaps 30 ordinary English laborers. At that rate, Battle Crease House was not a country seat. It was a financial countdown. On the 27th of April, James came home from a business trip ill. He complained of numbness in his limbs, vomiting, stomach pain. He had taken, he said, a double dose of an anti-nausea medicine called neurotonin, prescribed by his doctor. He took to his bed. His condition oscillated for the next 2 weeks. Some days he rallied. Some days he collapsed. His usual physician, Dr. Humphreys, was summoned. Dr. Humphreys believed he was dealing with a case of chronic dyspepsia, complicated by strain. He prescribed bismuth, diluted prussic acid, arsenic drops. He added, in other words, more poison to an already poisoned man, believing this was the logic of his profession. Florence nursed her husband. She sat with him. She administered his medicines. She coaxed him to eat beef tea and milk puddings. To the household staff, including Alice Yap, the young nanny she had hired for the children, the mistress of Battle Crease House appeared, on the surface, to be doing everything a good wife should do. Alice Yap did not, however, believe she was looking at a good wife. And on the morning of the 8th of May, Alice Yap would walk into Florence's bedroom and see something that, in her own mind at least, would confirm everything she had already decided to believe. Chapter 5. The Flypaper in the Wash Basin. On a spring morning in 1889, the family nanny walked into her mistress's bedroom and saw arsenic soaking in a bowl of water. Alice Yap was 27 years old. She was a Liverpool woman from a modest background who had taken the battle crease position the previous year. She was plain, capable, observant, and, according to everyone who worked with her, deeply moralistic. She had decided, within weeks of taking the job, that Mrs. Maybrick was not the kind of mistress she approved of. Florence was too American, too young, too pretty, too fond of dancing, too quick with the sharp remark. And after the London trip, when rumors of Alfred Brierly drifted back through the servants' hall, Alice Yap had made up her mind. On the morning in question, Alice walked into the bedroom carrying linen. On the washstand was a porcelain basin. In the basin were several sheets of flypaper, the yellow commercial variety manufactured by Mather of Manchester, submerged in water. The water had turned a cloudy brown. A cover of cloth lay draped over the basin. Alice Yap knew what flypapers contained. Every literate Englishwoman did. The packets were sold under labels warning of arsenic. She did not confront her mistress. She walked back downstairs and said nothing. But she remembered. Florence's own explanation, offered then and offered ever after, was domestic and ordinary. Flypapers soaked in water were a widely known Victorian cosmetic preparation. The arsenic solution, dabbed on the skin, was believed to clear complexions, reduce blemishes, and produce the fashionable pale bloom that every well-born woman of 1889 pursued. The recipe was printed in ladies' magazines. It was traded among friends. A box of Fowler's solution, prescribed by physicians for anemia, was essentially the same preparation in a smaller bottle. Whether Florence was preparing a face wash or preparing a poison, the flypapers alone could not answer. What they could do, in the hands of a hostile nanny and a suspicious brother-in-law, was become evidence. James Maybrick's condition worsened through the first week of May. On the evening of the 8th, Florence wrote a letter to Alfred Brierly. The letter was passionate, imprudent, disastrous. She wrote that her husband was seriously ill and might yet die, and she used the kind of phrases that no one once read aloud in a courtroom. She sealed it. She handed it to Alice Yap to post. Alice Yap did not post it. She would later claim that the envelope had fallen in a puddle and that she had opened it to check the address. Almost no one believed her then. Almost no one believes her now. What is clear is that she read it, and what is also clear is that within hours, the letter was in the hands of James Maybrick's brothers. The brothers had already been circling. Michael Maybrick was the senior of them, a successful London baritone who performed under the stage name Stephen Adams and who had, from the beginning, disliked Florence. Thomas Maybrick was the merchant brother. Edwin Maybrick was a cotton associate of James. Together, they formed a family alliance that had never trusted the young American wife. And now they had a letter proving she had taken a lover while her husband lay dying. On the 11th of May, 1889, they acted. Florence was effectively placed under house arrest in her own home. She was confined to a bedroom. She was not permitted to enter her husband's sick room. She was not permitted to handle his medicines. The nurses were instructed to watch her. Michael Maybrick supervised the household. Florence, still the mistress of Battle Crease House on paper, had been removed from the chessboard while the endgame played out around her. James Maybrick died that evening, the 11th of May, at about 8:30. He had been complaining in his final hours of the taste of his beef tea. A bottle of Valentine's meat juice, a commercial invalid tonic commonly given to the bedridden, was found on his nightstand. It was sealed when Florence had handled it earlier that day. It had, at some point, been opened. When it was tested by chemists after his death, it contained just under half a grain of arsenic. That bottle, more than the flypapers, more than the letter, more than the black eye, would be the thing the prosecution hung its case on. The other toxicological findings were less decisive than the headlines would suggest. Arsenic was found in James Maybrick's liver, but only about 20 milligrams of it. Traces were found in his intestines, in his kidneys, but the total recovered was a fraction of what a fatal dose would have deposited. A standard forensic benchmark at the time placed the fatal threshold for recovered arsenic near 100 milligrams in the major organs. James Maybrick's post-mortem showed about 1/5 of that. He had died with arsenic in him, but not by the strict arithmetic of the Marsh test, obviously of it. The man was a chronic arsenic eater. His own doctor had prescribed poison. His own chemist had sold him poison 5 times a day. His body was, toxicologically, a chemistry set in slow collapse. Whether Florence had added the final grain, or whether James had poisoned himself with one stubborn overdose too many, and was a question the physical evidence alone could not settle. The flypapers in the basin had given the Maybrick brothers a narrative. The letter to Brierly had given them a motive. The meat juice bottle had given them a weapon. It was enough for an inquest. It was enough for an arrest. On the 14th of May, 1889, 3 days after James's death, Florence Maybrick was formally charged with his murder. She was 26 years old. She had 2 children who were taken from her the same week. She had, in the Liverpool newspapers, become overnight the most famous accused woman in the English-speaking world. Her mother, the Baroness, was summoned urgently from the continent, and waiting for her at the end of the summer, at the Liverpool Assizes, was a judge whose mind was already beginning to slip its moorings, whose summation would last 2 full days, and whose black cap would fall on the wrong head. Chapter 6. The American Heiress on Trial for Her Life. When the judge placed the black cap atop his wig on the 7th of August, 1889, Florence Maybrick became the first American woman sentenced to hang in an English court. The trial had opened on the 31st of July at St. George's Hall in Liverpool, in a courtroom packed so tightly that spectators fainted in the galleries. Florence sat in the dock in a black silk dress, a small veiled hat, her hands folded in her lap. The Attorney General for England, Sir Charles Russell, had taken her defense personally, an extraordinary intervention that suggested the case had been understood from the start as something more than a local poisoning. The prosecution, led by John Addison, walked the jury through the accumulated narrative. The flypapers soaked in the basin, the letter to Brierly, the bottle of Valentine's meat juice, the history of the London hotel, the black eye, the strained household finances, the will that had cut Florence to a life interest. They called chemist after chemist, nurse after nurse. They called Alice Yap, who described the basin, the letter, the strange behavior she had observed. Sir Charles Russell rose for the defense. He did 3 things, each of them, in theory, sufficient to create reasonable doubt. He established, through the testimony of chemist Edwin Heaton, that James Maybrick had been a lifelong and habitual arsenic eater, consuming the drug in quantities that would have bewildered a toxicologist. He introduced the flypaper cosmetic use defense, calling women who testified that soaking the papers for facial preparations was a common, even fashionable practice. And he emphasized the inconvenient truth of the post-mortem, that the amount of arsenic actually recovered from James Maybrick's organs was below the standard fatal threshold. It was, by any reasonable reading, a reasonable doubt case. A chronic arsenic eater had died after a fortnight's illness. His body contained arsenic, but not quite enough. His wife, who had a lover and a motive, had also soaked flypapers in a basin, but could plausibly have done so for her complexion. The weapon was ubiquitous. The victim was self-poisoning. The case for murder rested ultimately not on chemistry, but on character. And that was precisely the ground the judge chose to stand on. Mr. Justice Fitzjames Stephen had been a towering figure of Victorian law. He had written the Code of Evidence. He had served in India. He had published volumes on the philosophy of criminal justice. By the summer of 1889, he was also, to those who looked closely, visibly unwell. His memory was slipping. His temper was erratic. He had begun on the bench to lose the thread of arguments. His summing up to the jury lasted 2 full days, the 7th and 8th of August. It ran to many hours of rambling commentary. He returned compulsively and at length to Florence's adultery. He reminded the jury that she had been unfaithful to her husband. He invited them to consider what sort of woman would take such a lover. He described her letter to Brierly as the letter of a horrible woman, of a woman from whom almost anything might be expected. He told them that when a woman had committed adultery, the line from that sin to murder was not a long one. The toxicological evidence in his 2-day summation occupied a fraction of the time given to her moral failings. The jury deliberated for 38 minutes. They returned a verdict of guilty. Justice Stephen placed the black cap upon his wig and sentenced Florence to death by hanging. Her execution was scheduled for the 26th of August. The verdict produced an eruption. It produced one on both sides of the Atlantic. In the United States, where newspapers had been following the trial obsessively, editorial reaction ranged from outraged to incredulous. In England, public petitions gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures. The American ambassador intervened. Sir Charles Russell lobbied the Home Office directly. The Baroness von Roches worked her continental contacts with the ferocity of a woman whose daughter's neck was in a rope. The Home Secretary, Henry Matthews, confronted an impossible file. To carry out the sentence would be to hang a woman on a case widely perceived as unsafe. To commute it would be to contradict a jury. He split the difference. On the 22nd of August, he issued an extraordinary memorandum. It stated that the evidence led him to believe that Florence Maybrick had administered poison to her husband with intent to murder, but that it could not be conclusively shown that the poison she administered had caused his death. On that logic, the death sentence was commuted to penal servitude for life. It was a verdict of neither acquittal nor conviction. It was, in effect, the legal system confessing that it did not know what had happened in Battle Crease House, but intended to punish her anyway. Florence was transferred in shackles to Woking Prison, and from there, in short order, to Her Majesty's Prison at Aylesbury in Buckinghamshire, the institution that would hold her for the next 15 years. The cell measured a handful of square feet. She wore the coarse brown serge of a convict. Her hair was cropped. Her name, on the rolls, became a number. The judge who sentenced her did not long outlast the trial. Justice Fitzjames Stephen's mental decline accelerated through 1890 and 1891. He was quietly retired from the bench in 1891. He was committed to an asylum where he died in 1894, 5 years after placing the black cap on his wig. Whatever had already been disintegrating in him during the 2 days of his summation, had continued, in the privacy of his own rooms, to disintegrate. The nanny Alice Yap married a few years after the trial and passed quietly out of the public record. Alfred Brierly went abroad. Michael Maybrick retired from the stage and lived in comfortable prosperity on the Isle of Wight. Sarah Ann Robertson sued the estate and lost. The children, Bobo and Gladys, were raised by James's brother, Thomas. Florence sat in her cell in Aylesbury. She did needlework. She read the prison chaplain's books. She received no letters from her children because no letters were permitted. She did not, until she was 41 years old, step outside those walls. And while she disappeared into the English prison system, across the Atlantic, the 2 more women were walking the same road toward the same pharmacy counter for reasons that had nothing to do with Liverpool and everything to do with the same cage. Chapter 7. The Love Letter That Traveled by Postal Service. On the 9th of August, 1898, a box of chocolates arrived on a Delaware porch bearing a tender note and enough arsenic to kill 6 people. The porch belonged to a modest house in Dover, Delaware, where Mary Elizabeth Dunning was raising 2 small daughters. Mary Elizabeth's husband, John Preston Dunning, was a rising man. He was a war correspondent for the Associated Press, currently stationed in Puerto Rico, covering the final weeks of the Spanish-American War. He was also, at 37, a father to her 2 children, a handsome man in his prime, and, unbeknownst to Mary Elizabeth, the great love of another woman's life. That other woman was Cordelia Botkin. She was 44 years old, plump, dark-haired, a fading San Francisco beauty with a husband she did not live with and a son she did not raise. Her husband, Welcome A. Botkin, was a wealthy Stockton grain merchant who had, some years earlier, agreed to a separation in which he paid her a regular remittance to live apart from him. The arrangement gave her the thing most married women of her class could not have: money and distance, and nobody watching her door. Cordelia had met John Preston Dunning in the summer of 1895 at Golden Gate Park. He had approached her. He had followed her. Within weeks, they were lovers. Within months, they were conducting an affair out of room 26 of the Hotel Victoria in San Francisco. Dunning was married. He had a wife and a small daughter in Oakland. He had, at the time, a promising position with the Associated Press. Cordelia did not care. For 3 years, she had him. Dunning's marriage had been souring since long before Cordelia. When the war broke out with Spain in the spring of 1898, he leaped at the chance to cover it from the front. He left San Francisco in late May. Cordelia, left behind, wrote him passionate letters across the continent and then across the Caribbean. She waited for his return. She had, by then, reorganized her life around him. In early August, Dunning sent her a letter. It was, by her standards, a catastrophe. He told her the war was over. He told her he was returning to the United States. He told her he was returning to his wife. The affair, which she had understood to be the central relationship of her life, was, for him, an episode he was now closing. Cordelia went to work. She consulted, over the following days, with a woman named Almura Roof, a neighbor and acquaintance, asking pointed questions. What was the best way to send an anonymous letter? Could a postmark be disguised? What about poisons? Were there poisons that could not be traced? Mrs. Ruff, who would later testify, noticed the questions but did not yet connect them to a plan. On or about the 5th of August, Cordelia walked into a San Francisco drugstore operated by a druggist named Frank Gray. She purchased 2 ounces of white arsenic. She signed the poison register. She gave, in signing it, a name. The name itself would become part of the case against her. She returned home. She purchased a box of bonbon chocolates from the George Haas Candy Company, a well-known San Francisco confectioner. She carefully opened a number of the chocolates. She worked arsenic into the fillings. She resealed them. She placed them back in the box. She wrapped the box in brown paper. She wrote a note in a disguised handwriting. The note read, in the tender phrasing of a loving friend, that the chocolates were a small token from a well-wisher. She signed it with an initial, suggesting a mutual acquaintance. She addressed the parcel to Mrs. John P. Dunning in Dover, Delaware. She dropped it in the mail. The parcel crossed the continent over several days. It arrived in Dover on the 9th of August. Mary Elizabeth Dunning opened it on her porch. She shared the chocolates with her sister, Mrs. Joshua Dean, who was visiting with her own children. Between the 2 sisters and the surrounding family, several people ate from the box over the following hour. Within a day, 4 of them were violently ill. Mary Elizabeth Dunning died on the 10th of August. Mrs. Dean died the same day. 2 children who had eaten from the box recovered slowly. The family doctor suspected poisoning almost immediately. The box was preserved. The wrapping was preserved. The note was preserved. John Preston Dunning, summoned home from the Caribbean, arrived in Dover to find his wife dead, his sister-in-law dead, and a parcel sitting on a table that he recognized with sickening clarity as handwriting he knew. The investigation was unusually swift. The handwriting on the note was compared to Cordelia's known writing samples, including old letters she had sent to Dunning. Experts testified that the disguised hand was hers. The wrapping paper was traced to a San Francisco stationer. The chocolates were traced to the George Haas Candy Company. The poison purchase was traced to Frank Gray's drugstore. The signature in the poison register was matched to her. Cordelia Botkin was arrested in San Francisco. The case raised a novel jurisdictional question. The poison had been bought in California. The chocolates had been prepared in California. The parcel had been mailed in California, but the victims had died in Delaware. Which state should try the case? The question was answered in favor of California. Cordelia was tried in San Francisco for murder under the theory that the fatal act, the preparation and mailing of the poisoned chocolates, they had occurred in that state regardless of where the victims happened to die. The ruling would become a precedent for cross-state mail crimes for decades afterward. The trial opened in December of 1898. The jury heard the handwriting experts. They heard the druggist. They heard the stationer. They heard Almura Roof describe the questions about anonymous letters. They heard, most damningly, Cordelia's own signed entry in the poison register. The defense tried to suggest that the chocolates could have been tampered with by someone else along the postal route, that the handwriting evidence was weak, that Dunning himself had enemies. The jury was not persuaded. Cordelia Botkin was convicted of murder in the first degree and sentenced to life in San Quentin. She did not have the shield of coverture to hide behind. She did not have the argument that she had been trapped. She had a regular remittance, a legal separation, and a lover who had simply decided to go home to his wife. The question her case posed, and the question that separates her from Florence Maybrick in the deepest way, is the question of why a woman with comparatively ordinary options chose the extreme answer anyway. The answer, perhaps, is that the cage was not always the law. Sometimes the cage was the story a woman had told herself about her one great love, and the intolerable moment when that story proved to be smaller than she had believed. And while Cordelia waited for transfer to San Quentin, a different wealthy woman had already answered the same question 3 years earlier in a way that involved a tin pail and a 10-year-old child. Chapter 8. The Pail of Chowder Carried by a Child. On the afternoon of the 30th of August, 1895, a 10-year-old girl named Gracie carried a tin pail through Harlem to her grandmother's door. Her full name was Grace Fleming. She was the oldest child of Mary Alice Livingston Fleming, and she lived in a state of perpetual low-level confusion about who she was and where she belonged. Her mother had 4 children by now, or almost 4, because the 4th was still in the belly. None of them had the same father. None of them had been born in wedlock. Grace had been born in Paris during one of her mother's prolonged European retreats, a pattern by which the Livingston family periodically sent Mary Alice abroad to have her children quietly and return with an altered story. The Livingstons were, on paper, one of the oldest and most distinguished families in the state of New York. Their ancestors had signed the Declaration. They had built Hudson Valley estates that rose in stone above the river. They had intermarried with the Astors, the Van Rensselaers, the Schuylers. To carry the Livingston name in 1895 was to carry almost 2 centuries of American aristocracy. To carry the Livingston name and be an unmarried mother of 3 children, pregnant with a 4th, was to carry a scandal that could not be fully buried, no matter how many European holidays were invoked. Mary Alice was the daughter of Robert Swift Livingston, a Hudson Valley gentleman of impeccable name and modest practical wealth, and Evelina Livingston Bliss, a proud matriarch who had, after her first husband's death, married a second man named Henry Bliss, upon Robert Swift. Livingston's death, he had left his daughter a substantial inheritance, reported at the time as $80,000, which in 1895 was the equivalent of several $1 million today. The inheritance, as was the custom of the period, was held in a life interest trust. Mary Alice received the income. The principal was managed by trustees, and, crucially, the arrangement stipulated that in the event of her death, or in the event of certain behaviors that might cause the family to intervene, the flow of funds could be adjusted or cut off entirely. By the summer of 1895, Mary Alice had become a problem for the Livingstons. The illegitimate children, the public relationships, the debts, the rumors. Her mother, Evelina Bliss, had sided increasingly with her second husband, Henry Bliss, who had begun taking a harder line. On or about the 28th of August, 1895, Henry Bliss informed Mary Alice that her monthly support from the Livingston Trust, administered through the family, was being cut off. She would have, at a stroke, no money, 4 children, no husband, no support, and, one imagines, very little patience left. 2 days later, on the 30th of August, Mary Alice Fleming prepared a pail of clam chowder in her rented apartment in New York City. She added arsenic to the chowder. She sealed the tin pail. She handed it to her 10-year-old daughter Grace with instructions. Grace was to carry the pail to her grandmother Evelina Bliss, who lived in a respectable building in Harlem, and deliver it with a loving message. Grace did as she was told. She walked through the Harlem streets on a late summer afternoon, a slight 10-year-old girl carrying a tin pail of soup, on an errand that appeared in every surface detail to be an act of filial tenderness. She arrived at her grandmother's apartment. She handed over the pail. Evelina Bliss, delighted at the unexpected kindness from a difficult daughter she had not seen in days, thanked her granddaughter. Grace went home. Evelina ate a bowl of the chowder at her evening meal. By that night, she was desperately ill. By the following morning, she was dead. The attending physician, initially believing that an older woman had suffered a summer gastric attack, agreed to an autopsy when the circumstances became public. The contents of her stomach tested positive for arsenic. The remaining chowder in the pail tested positive. The focus turned with immediate speed to the only person who had benefited from the woman's death, Mary Alice Livingston Fleming, whose support had been cut off 2 days earlier, whose mother had become the obstacle to her inheritance, and whose 10-year-old daughter had been seen carrying the chowder pail, was arrested. She was held in the Tombs, the infamous Manhattan prison, while the case was prepared. She was, at her arrest, visibly pregnant. She would give birth to her 4th child, a daughter, while still in custody, in the unusual position of being an accused matricide delivering a baby on state premises. The prosecution's theory was stark. Mary Alice had weaponized her own 10-year-old daughter. She had used a child as the delivery vehicle for the murder of that child's grandmother. She had done it for money. She had done it because the Livingston family, through Henry Bliss, had turned off the faucet that kept her illegitimate household afloat, and the only way to turn it back on was to remove her own mother from the chain of life interests that held her inheritance. The evidence was strong. The arsenic was present. The motive was present. The delivery mechanism was documented. Grace herself, pressed, described the errand. A neighborhood druggist connected the purchase. The pail, the chowder, the autopsy, the trust document, the cut-off letter from Bliss. They all pointed the same direction. On paper, Mary Alice Livingston Fleming faced a conviction as certain as Cordelia Botkin's would be 3 years later. But she faced a New York jury, and New York juries in 1896 were made up of 12 men, and 12 men faced with the proposition that a mother would use her own 10-year-old daughter as the instrument of murder against her own mother, discovered collectively that they could not quite believe it. The trial would open in the spring of 1896, and the verdict that followed would establish one of the strangest asymmetries of the Gilded Age. 2 wealthy women, nearly identical evidence, and 2 completely different Americas. Chapter 9. 2 verdicts, 2 Americas. Within 3 years, American juries heard nearly identical evidence against 2 wealthy women and delivered 2 completely opposite verdicts. Mary Alice Livingston Fleming went on trial in New York in the spring of 1896. The prosecution, led by the district attorney's office, laid out the case with efficiency. As they produced the chowder pail, they produced the toxicological results, they produced the druggist who had sold the arsenic, they produced the cut-off letter from Henry Bliss, they produced the will and the trust documents that showed the financial motive. They produced, most painfully, the testimony establishing that Grace Fleming, the 10-year-old daughter, had carried the pail. The defense did not try to dispute most of the physical evidence. Instead, they built a case around the impossibility of what the prosecution was asking the jury to believe. They put Mary Alice on the stand, dressed in mourning, heavily pregnant, or recently delivered, depending on the hearing. They brought Grace to the courthouse. They leaned hard on the single, central, terrible question that the jury could not stop asking itself. Would a mother do this? Would a mother really put poison into a bowl of soup, hand the bowl to a 10-year-old girl, and send the girl across Harlem to feed that soup to the girl's own grandmother? Would any mother do that? The jury could not say yes. They deliberated. They came back. They acquitted her. Mary Alice Livingston Fleming walked out of the tombs in June of 1896, a free woman. She left with her 4 children, the youngest born in custody. And within months, the machinery of the Livingston Trust quietly operated as designed. With her mother dead, certain life interests in the family settlements shifted. Mary Alice eventually received her $80,000, which by the early 20th century was a fortune that would have paid off most of her debts and funded a comfortable retirement. In San Francisco, 3 years later, Cordelia Botkin faced a jury that looked at nearly the same shape of evidence and reached the opposite conclusion. The Botkin case had, at its center, the same structure: a woman, a poison purchase, a disguised delivery, a dead female victim, a documented motive. But the Botkin jury did not have to believe that Cordelia had weaponized her own child. They had only to believe that she had, in a fit of jealous rage, mailed a box of chocolates to a rival woman across the country. That they could imagine. That they convicted her for in the first degree and sent her to San Quentin for life. The legal legacy of the 2 cases diverged accordingly. The Botkin case produced a major jurisdictional precedent. The California appellate courts, in reviewing her appeals, it upheld the principle that a state in which a criminal act was initiated could try the offender even if the consequences fell in another state. The ruling became influential in the law of cross-state mail crimes, poisonings, and, much later, in the prosecution of telecommunications and wire fraud cases that crossed state lines. The Fleming case produced nothing. It produced no precedent. It produced no reform. It produced a Livingston heiress walking out of a Manhattan courthouse with her inheritance more or less intact and her freedom entirely restored. The difference between the 2 outcomes was not the weight of evidence. It was the shape of the story the jury had to swallow. Cordelia Botkin fit a template the jury already had: the scorned mistress, the poisoned rival, the unwomanly female who had dared to want a man too much. She was punishable because she had violated the rule that women were supposed to accept their abandonment meekly. She had turned her jealousy into a weapon, and American juries were prepared to punish that transgression severely. Mary Alice Fleming did not fit a template the jury could swallow. She was a mother. The victim was the mother's own mother. The delivery vehicle was the mother's own daughter. To convict her, the jury would have had to accept a picture of female villainy deeper and more unnatural than the American imagination of 1896 was prepared to entertain. The archetype of the mother in Victorian culture still functioned as a moral bulwark. Mothers did not do this. Therefore, this mother had not done this. It was easier to acquit than to accept that the bulwark had a crack in it. The Florence Maybrick case sat between the 2. She was a wife and a mother, but she was also an adulteress, an American foreigner, a young woman married to a much older English man. Her trial had turned, as Justice Stephen had made plain, not on her chemistry, but on her character. She was punishable because she had crossed a sexual line. The arsenic and the fly papers only confirmed what the adultery had already made possible. In all 3 cases, the underlying question the juries answered was not really, did she do it? It was, does this shape of woman belong in the category where she could have done it? Cordelia Botkin did, Florence Maybrick almost did, and the English jury put her in that category. Mary Alice Livingston Fleming did not, and the American jury refused to put her there. This is the uncomfortable fact that runs underneath the forensic testimony of the entire age. The Marsh test, for all its precision, could tell the jury whether there was arsenic in the body. It could not tell them whether they were willing to believe a woman who looked like this had put it there. And so the verdicts finally were verdicts about imagination. The practical consequences followed the verdicts. Cordelia Botkin entered San Quentin in 1899. She would never leave it. Mary Alice Livingston Fleming walked out into the rest of her life with her daughter Grace at her side. The girl who had carried the pail and was never, as far as any record shows, given an adequate explanation for what she had actually carried that day. And across the ocean, in Aylesbury Prison, Florence Maybrick was serving her 7th year of a sentence that would eventually reach 15, her clothes coarse, her hair cropped, her children strangers to her, while the world outside rearranged itself into new centuries and new fashions. The question of what happened next to each of them, after the courts had spoken their final sentences, is its own cold lesson in how the Gilded Age treated the women it had half destroyed. Chapter 10. 15 years in an English prison cell. When Florence Maybrick walked out of Aylesbury Prison on the 25th of January, 1904, she was 41 years old and had not seen her children in 15 years. She walked out into an English winter. A car was waiting. Supporters had arranged a quiet departure, away from the press, away from the public. She wore a long, dark coat. Her hair, and once copper and carefully dressed, was gray at the temples. She weighed less than she had when she entered. She had spent 15 years in a cell measuring not many more square feet than a modest bathroom. She had eaten prison food. She had done prison needlework. She had, for the first 3 years, been subject to a rule of silence that prevented her from speaking to other prisoners. Her children had grown up without her. Bobo, the son born at Battle Crease, was 21 years old. Gladys was 17. They had been raised by James's brother Thomas and his wife in a small town in North Wales. They had been told, gently and firmly, that their mother was a woman they need not know. Bobo had taken a degree in mining engineering. Gladys was a young woman who had never received a letter from her mother that was not filtered through a prison censor. Florence was taken first to Cornwall, to the convent of the Epiphany at Truro, where she spent 6 months in seclusion under the care of Anglican sisters. She was trying to remember how to be a person. She ate meals that were not slop. She walked on grass. She heard birds that were not confined behind glass. She wrote letters to friends in America in a hand that had relearned cursive after a decade and a half of strict prison lettering. She returned to the United States in the late summer of 1904. She was, by the measure of the newspapers, one of the most famous living women in the English-speaking world. A reception was arranged in New York. She was embraced by reformers. She was, for a brief season, a celebrity of a morbid and reluctant kind. She tried to build a second life on that notoriety. She wrote a book titled My 15 Lost Years, published in 1905. She embarked on an American lecture circuit, speaking about prison conditions, about the need for reform in the English criminal justice system, about the experience of having been convicted in a case she insisted to her dying day she had not committed. Her talks drew substantial audiences in the first years. She advocated for what would eventually become, in 1907, the English Court of Criminal Appeal, a body whose creation was due in significant part to the outcry over her own case. The lectures faded. The public moved on. By 1910, she was no longer a headliner. By 1912, she was working odd jobs, living in rented rooms, and running through the modest sums she had raised from her book and her tours. Her mother, the Baroness von Roches, had died. Her lawyers had not recovered what remained of James Maybrick's estate for her. She had, in her late 40s, very little of anything. Then in 1911, her son Bobo died. The circumstances were its own private cruelty. Bobo had gone to Canada as a mining engineer. He was working at an assay office, a position that involved handling chemicals. On the 10th of April, 1911, at the age of 28, he drank from a glass of water that was later found to have been contaminated with a cyanide solution. His death was ruled an accident. He had, the inquest determined, mistaken a working solution for drinking water in the laboratory. Florence received the news in a small New York rooming house. The son of the most famous arsenic poisoning conviction of the 19th century had been killed by a different poison. The irony did not go unnoticed in the press, which briefly resurrected her old story before moving on. She wrote letters to Bobo's colleagues. She asked for every detail. She received a handful of answers, and then the silence that closes over all middle-aged women without money. Gladys, the daughter, had married by then. She had made it clear that she did not wish to be publicly associated with her mother. Florence did not press her. She seems to have understood, in her slow and wounded way, that her daughter's right to a normal life outweighed her own desire for reconnection. Her remaining decades were a long, quiet disappearance. She moved around the American Northeast, and she ran a small boarding operation for a while. She worked as a housekeeper. By the mid-1920s, she had settled in Gaylordsville, Connecticut, in a 3-room cottage at the edge of the woods. She had, by then, begun to keep cats. By the end of her life, she kept many of them. The neighbors called her, with a mixture of affection and unease, the Cat Lady of South Kent. She kept a scrapbook. It contained clippings from the Liverpool trial, photographs of Battle Crease House, a pressed flower from a bouquet received at her book launch, a program from one of her lecture dates, a photograph of Bobo. She was the keeper of her own ruined monument. She died alone in that 3-room cottage on the 23rd of October, 1941. She was 79 years old. The neighbors had not seen her in several days. They found her on the floor. She had been dead for some time. Cats still circled her body. The New York Times ran her obituary at the top of the front page the following morning. The most famous accused poisoner of the Gilded Age, the American heiress who had walked onto the SS Baltic at 17, who had been sentenced to hang at 26, who had disappeared into an English prison for 15 years, and who had re-emerged into a country that did not know what to do with her, had ended her life as a footnote cared for only by the animals who did not remember her trial. Meanwhile, in America, the other 2 women had traveled their own different paths, and one of them had gotten exactly what she killed for. Chapter 11. The Prison Cell and the Manhattan Apartment. Cordelia Botkin died in her San Quentin cell in 1910, while the woman acquitted of matricide quietly collected her inheritance and lived another 52 years. Cordelia entered San Quentin in 1899 after her conviction was upheld on appeal. She was in her mid-40s. She was plump, dark, imperious, and utterly unaccustomed to confinement. She had never worked. She had, for all of her adult life, been a woman with a husband's remittance check and the freedom to pursue her affairs. The prison system had not been designed with women like her in mind. There were persistent rumors throughout her decade of confinement that Cordelia Botkin received privileges not extended to other female inmates, that her cell was more comfortable than the norm, that she was permitted visitors who would not have been permitted to see another prisoner, in that she received delicacies from outside, that she was allowed to wear her own clothes in certain hours, that her rich brother was permitted to supply her discreetly with small luxuries. The rumors were never fully documented. The prison administration denied most of them. What is clear is that she moved through her sentence with less suffering than poorer women endured. She did not, however, escape the sentence. Her health declined steadily through the first decade of the 20th century. She suffered from what her contemporaries called softening of the brain, a 19th century term that covered a range of neurological conditions. She grew confused. She grew paranoid. She grew weaker. She died in her cell on the 7th of March, 1910, at the age of 56. She had served just over 11 years. John Preston Dunning, the war correspondent whose abandonment had set the entire tragedy in motion, fared almost as badly. His Associated Press career collapsed after his wife's death and the scandal of the Botkin trial. He had been a promising foreign correspondent. He became, after 1900, an unemployable one. He drifted. He drank. He lost the respect of his colleagues. He died in 1907, 3 years before Cordelia, in poverty in a New York rooming house, having spent the last years of his life trying and failing to rebuild a career that had been, at its peak, one of the most enviable in American journalism. The affair had not just killed 2 women in Delaware. It had destroyed the man for whom those women had been killed. Mary Alice Livingston Fleming, by contrast, prospered. After her acquittal in June of 1896, she left the Tombs with her 4 children. She did not, initially, re-enter New York society. Society would not have her back. But she did re-enter, quietly and steadily, the financial machinery her mother's death had reset. The $80,000 that had been suspended behind Evelina Bliss's life interest flowed, within a couple of years, into her own hands. It was not an instantaneous transfer. There were trustees, cousins, challenges. But by the turn of the century, the money she had been denied was substantially hers. She used it carefully. She traveled. She spent extended periods in Europe, where her American scandal was less known. She raised her children privately. Grace, the 10-year-old who had carried the pail, grew up. She married. She had her own life. There is no record in the surviving documents of mother and daughter ever speaking about the afternoon of the 30th of August, 1895. The silence around that errand is, in some ways, the most haunting fact of the entire case. Mary Alice lived the rest of her life in comfortable, if unspectacular, style. She outlived most of the figures in her own trial. She outlived the prosecutors. She outlived the judge. She outlived the lawyers. She outlived, by 2 full generations, the journalists who had covered her arraignment. She had ceased, by 1920, to be news. She had ceased, by 1930, to be remembered. She died on an ordinary day in 1948 at the age of 94. Her death received a small notice in the New York papers. Most of the readers who saw it could not have said who she was. The contrast is almost grotesque. And Cordelia Botkin, who killed 2 people in another state over a broken affair, died a prisoner at 56. Florence Maybrick, whose case may never have been a murder at all, lost 15 years in an English prison and died alone in a Connecticut cottage, surrounded by cats. Mary Alice Livingston Fleming, who on the evidence weaponized her own 10-year-old daughter to poison her own mother, collected her inheritance, and lived to 94. This is not a story with a moral about justice. This is a story about whose story the jury was willing to believe, and whose afterward the society was willing to tolerate. It also invites an uncomfortable hypothesis. If Mary Alice Livingston Fleming did what the prosecution said she did, and walked free, and inherited the fortune she had been trying to unblock, then, in at least one documented Gilded Age case, the murder worked. The woman got exactly what she killed for. She got it because of her family name, because of the jury's unwillingness to imagine a mother in that category, and because the American judicial system, for all its machinery, could not bring itself to brand a Livingston a matricide. If it worked once, publicly, it worked more than once, privately. And that brings us to the quietest part of this whole story. The part that does not appear in the trial transcripts. The part that did not make the newspapers. The part that consists of all the respectable men who died in bed, whose wives wept at the funeral, and whose death certificates read gastric fever because no one had any reason to test the liver. Chapter 12. The women who were never caught. For every wealthy husband whose death became a newspaper scandal, dozens more were buried quietly under a diagnosis of gastric fever, and no one ever asked why. The number cannot be known. That is the nature of the thing. A successful poisoning, by definition, leaves no mark in the public record. It leaves a widow in black, a coffin in a churchyard, a probate filing, and a household that reorganizes around the absence of a man whose death surprised no one because he had, after all, been unwell. The physicians of the Gilded Age signed death certificates in the tens of thousands each year, using diagnostic categories that were little more than polite gestures: gastric fever, bilious attack, English cholera, inflammation of the bowels, dyspepsia with complications. The terms covered a spectrum of conditions ranging from food poisoning to typhoid to appendicitis to unknown cancers to, yes, arsenic. Modern forensic historians who have gone back to the period and attempted to estimate how often domestic poisoning was missed have produced numbers that, by their own admission, are guesses resting on guesses. Some studies of English and American death, records from the 1880s and 1890s, have suggested that for every poisoning that resulted in a trial, there may have been anywhere from 5 to 15 cases in which the poisoning was never suspected. Some scholars place the figure higher, some place it lower. All of them agree that the unknown vastly exceeds the known. What we do know is this: arsenic does not vanish. It stays in the bones for years. In the late 19th century, a number of exhumations conducted for unrelated reasons, such as family disputes over wills, produced unexpected toxicological findings. Husbands long buried turned out to carry arsenic in their hair and nails. The findings were suppressed, embarrassing, or dismissed. The families preferred silence to scandal. The churches preferred peace to prosecution. The respectability that the silk cage had demanded of its occupants extended to the grave and then beyond it. This is the invisible fourth category of the Gilded Age poisoner. The woman whose husband died, whose symptoms were written off, whose body was committed to the family vault, and whose widow's weeds were entirely sincere to the outside world, because the outside world had no reason to suspect anything else. She inherited, she remarried, she lived into a peaceful old age. She was, from the standpoint of the social machinery that would have punished her, not a criminal. She was simply a widow. The three women we have followed in this film were, in a strange sense, the unlucky ones. Florence Maybrick was unlucky because she had soaked flypapers in front of a resentful nanny and written a passionate letter to a man her husband's brothers already disliked. Cordelia Botkin was unlucky because she had signed the poison register and written the address on the parcel in her own handwriting and had a neighbor who remembered her questions. Mary Alice Livingston Fleming, the exception who was acquitted, was lucky because she belonged to a family whose name could not be comfortably attached to the word matricide by a jury of 12 New York men. Each of them, had she done what she may or may not have done with only slightly more care, might have joined the invisible category. Florence might have used a different method, a smaller dose, a slower decline. Cordelia might have used a cleaner intermediary. Mary Alice might have sent a different courier. Luck and blunder are what brought their stories into the light. Competence is what kept the others in the dark. This is why, finally, the moral of these three cases is not a moral of individual wickedness. If we tell these stories as three portraits of evil women, we have misunderstood the thing we are looking at. The evil, such as it was, did not reside chiefly in the three individual psyches we have studied. It resided in the structure. It resided in a legal system that took women's property, their children, and their ability to walk away. It resided in a pharmaceutical industry that sold fatal substances for 2 pennies a sheet. It resided in a culture that taught women to measure their worth in marriage and punish them unsurvivably when they left it. Given those conditions, a certain small percentage of desperate and determined women were always going to walk to the chemist's counter. The surprise is not that a few did. The surprise is that so many did not. There is an uncomfortable echo in this for us. We no longer live under coverture. Married women in the United States and Britain own their property, retain their names, keep their children in separations, and can file for divorce without having to prove a second aggravating fault. The Married Women's Property Acts, beginning in Mississippi in 1839, extending through New York in 1848, and culminating in English legislation in the 1870s and 1880s, have done their slow work. The silk cage was dismantled, plank by plank, over the 20th century. We no longer sell arsenic for a penny at the drugstore. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, the later regulation of controlled substances, the establishment of modern toxicological testing, and the English Court of Criminal Appeal established in 1907, partly as a direct legacy of the Maybrick case, have all raised the cost of the crime and tightened the net around it. But the structural question remains. Every society builds cages. Every society stocks those cages with available means of desperate escape. The cages change. The poisons change. The people who find themselves trapped inside them do not change very much. They are, as they were in 1889, human beings of ordinary temperament pushed to extraordinary actions by conditions they did not design. The three women of this film stood at the pharmacy counter with their pennies and made a choice. History remembered 2 of them because they were caught. It remembered the third because her family name was too loud to silence. The women who walked to other counters, in other cities, in other years, and did the same thing more carefully, are not in this film. They are not in any film. They are the invisible majority, and they died peacefully in beds they inherited, in houses they had finally been permitted to own. The question the Gilded Age poisoner leaves us with is not why she did it. The answer to that is in the architecture of her life. The question is what invisible cages our own generation has built, and what cheap and terrible doors we have left standing at the back of them, and whose desperate coin is being counted at the counter tonight. The silk cage was made of law. It was also, in the end, made of silence. And silence, unlike arsenic, can be bought for nothing at all.